Okay, so we're focusing on the sort of the second portion of about Abraham, which begins with the story right after the circumcision, when Abraham is sitting at the opening of his tent waiting for the guests to come because he um, wants to do kindness. And for somebody who really wants to do kindness, the inability to do kindness is painful. And the story is told that the God appears to him. That's number one. And number two, he sees three people that show up, and it turns out later that they're angels, as we will see. The story doesn't say the words angels explicitly, but that's the context of the story. But he doesn't know that at this point, and instead he runs toward them to invite them into his tent with great alacrity, and he creates this tremendously elaborate, I don't know if it was breakfast, or actually it was lunch. It was midday, the heat of the day. It's an elaborate lunch. I guess they serve meat for lunch, unlike the United States, maybe like in Europe or Israel. So, and that is where he gets this. They tell him again. They reiterate again to him that his wife Sarah will have a son, and from there, the two of the three head to the city of Sodom, and ultimately the city of Sodom is destroyed, as we will read in Genesis chapter 18, as we will discuss and describe. But just to tie up a few points from last week before we continue. So we discussed at some length last week that there's a big difference between Abraham pre the circumcision and Abraham post the circumcision. And that is that Abraham before the circumcision, when he experienced the revelation from above, from God, when he experienced prophecy, he would not be able to remain in his senses. He would fall to the floor. And sort of go into a trance. Whereas after the circumcision, because now, as the Torah says, God tells Abraham, circumcise and you will be complete. So the circumcision represents the completion of the refinement of the body. So now the body is able to contain the intensity of the revelation, and Abraham is able to remain and sit at the opening of the tent, cognizant of the surroundings, cognizant of the people who are traveling, because he does see the three angels while experiencing revelation. So that's what we discussed last week. And the various commentators make that point. Make that point in various forms. But just to say that from a more of a Hasidic angle, it's not Chabad Hasidus, but it's a Hasidic commentary. And the Hasidic commentary says like this: when does this happen? After the circumcision. What is the circumcision? Circumcision is removing the covering. That's the physical act of the circumcision. But the physical act of the circumcision enables the person, or in the case of Abraham, it enables all his descendants, gives them the power to be able to remove the covering. But remove the covering of what? It's a much more general concept. Remove the covering of the concealment of the world. In other words, once the mitzvah of circumcision is introduced, now the concealment is removed from Abraham. And Abraham, therefore, could see God everywhere. Even when he's sitting in the tent by the heat of the day, seeing people, looking for people who are passing by. So Abraham could see God everywhere, because a principle of the Hasidic teachings are that there is a spark of God in everything and in everybody, in every creation, because creation needs the spark of God to continuously create it. And the reason why we don't see the spark of God is because there's the concealment. God creates a concealment. The circumcision is the spiritual, physical act of the mitzvah, but it gives you the power to remove the concealment and see the essence. If so, now Abraham could see God everywhere. And that's why it goes a direct connection. Right after the circumcision, Vayira alav Hashem, Hashem appeared to him. What does it mean Hashem appeared to him? Wherever Avram looks, now he is able to see the presence of God, because that is the spiritual benefit of the circumcision. So that's a very Hasidic interpretation premised on a Hasidic principle, which is there is God in everything and everywhere. The question is, are we going to see the externality? Are we going to see the cover, or are we able to peer beneath the cover and see the essence and see the good within every everything. Okay, so that's that. Now we get to a big subject, which is big in the sense that it's problematic, and everybody says something about it. And I'm not sure there's an easy way to explain it, but we'll have to introduce the problem, and then we'll see if we have any solutions, and then you see if you like any of the solutions. So I'm going to just open the book to Genesis chapter 18. I don't have the book here with me, so I don't know what page it is in the art scroll, but I will share the screen, God willing. So the angels come and he feeds them. After he feeds the angels, verse 9, and they said to him, the angels say to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, behold, in the tent. So they want to know where she is. In other words, where is she? Meaning this is about her. And he said, who is he? Rashi explains, there's the three guests, but of the three, there's the one who is the leader of the group, the leader of the bunch. And he is the one who tells Abraham, reiterates, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but he tells Abraham, and he said, I will surely return to you at this time next year. And behold, your wife Sarah will have a son. And Sarah heard from the entrance of the tent, and it was behind her. In other words, it was the entrance of the tent is behind her. So she overhears this conversation between the three guests and Abraham. And the three guests tell Abraham that I'm going to return in 1 year. In a year I will return, and Sarah will have a son. Now, the verse tells you, now Abraham and Sarah were old, coming in years. Sarah had ceased to have the way of woman. And Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have become worn out, will I have smooth flesh? And also my master is old. So basically she's laughing. Now, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, is it really true that I will give birth, although I am old? Is anything hidden from the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. So God comes to Abraham and says, why did Sarah laugh? Sarah laughs as if it's impossible. Is anything hidden from the Lord? In other words, the Lord can do anything. So God reiterates, I'm going to come back in a year and Sarah will have a son. So now the verse continues, and Sarah denied. So presumably Abraham asked Sarah the question that God asked Abraham in verse 13, which is, why did Sarah laugh? So it doesn't say it, but I presume Abraham asks Sarah, why did you laugh? And Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh, because she was afraid. And he said, no, but you laughed. That's the end of the laughter. Then the verse continues, and the men arose from there, and they looked upon Sodom, and Abraham went with them to escort them. Okay, we'll talk about that later. So this story of the laughter really begins, verse 12, 13, 14, 15. And it seems like a very simple story, that Sarah laughs because, again, it is funny, it's absurd that somebody at her age will have a child. And God tells Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Now, Sarah, it becomes defensive. She denies it. And Abraham says, no, you laughed. Okay, so first of all, what's the purpose of the story? Why do I need to know it? Why are you just trying to put down Sarah? What's happening here? But the question becomes even stronger, because if you look back to the previous chapter, the question becomes a very big question. Because in the previous chapter, God speaks to Abraham, and God tells Abraham that you're going to have a child. And what does Abraham do, of course? Abraham laughs. And what does God respond to Abraham's laughter? Nothing. So we have a big problem. Abraham laughs, that's not a problem. Sarah laughs, God gets offended and says, why did Sarah laugh? So this is a little bit of a problem. Why the difference? Why the change? How come when it comes to Abraham's laughter, how come when it comes to Abraham's laughter, that God doesn't intervene, doesn't mention anything, but Sarah, when Sarah laughs, God remembers to come in and say, why did you laugh? This is a big question that everybody has to deal with, starting from Rashi. But before we go there, Jill has a question. I just want to show you the verses. Okay, no, good, Jill, go ahead. But you're on mute. You have to unmute.
Okay, it's just a comment, Rabbi. He doesn't say it directly to Sarah. I think
Right.
we talked about this last time. I mean, when he addresses Hagar, he talks directly to Hagar. Here, this is really insulting.
Yeah.
And not only is he and okay, getting back to your other question, is the nature of the laughter different? That's
That's a good question. That's a good question. So we have to deal with that. So let's read the other verses. It's insulting. It's very interesting. Jill is right. God speaks to Abraham. God never speaks to Sarah. The only time God speaks to any of the patriarchs that we know of, again, the tradition says, the verse, the Medrash, the Talmud says that no, all the matriarchs were prophets. That's not a problem. But in the biblical text, it doesn't say anywhere that God spoke to the matriarchs, with one exception. It says God spoke to Rebecca. When Rebecca was pregnant with her twins, it says, Vatelach lidroshet Elokim, she went to inquire of God, of what's going on, because she had intense the pain. And then it says, Vayomer Hashem la, God told her, you will have two nations in your womb. In other words, you're having twins and each one will become a nation. So that's the only place where it says that God spoke to the matriarchs explicitly. Like I said, the rabbis believe that they were all prophetesses. But in any case, even there, where God spoke to Rebecca, the traditional reading is God didn't speak directly to Rebecca. God spoke to it was through the prophet. Vayomer Hashem la, God said to her, Rashi says through the prophet. She went to inquire of God. She went to inquire of a prophet. But that's part of the discussion. So that actually it's a broader discussion, but we maybe touch upon it. Not that I have the answer, but that's an interesting thing. God doesn't speak to, at least explicitly in the verse, God speaks to the patriarchs, not to the matriarchs. Maybe that's part of the question. Maybe that's part of the ingredient. Maybe that's part of the mix here. Maybe. Well, so hopefully we'll be able to at least address, not necessarily clarify. Go ahead, Steve, please. But you're on mute, so don't forget to unmute.
Thank you, Rabbi. I want to point out that laughter is cultural. My former colleague of mine, Jim Liu, was telling me about a cousin who, after having an X-ray, showed it to another cousin who was a physician. And the other cousin said, I don't see a problem. And so his cousin eventually died. And then a relative showed it to another doctor. And the other doctor said, oh yes, there it is in the X-ray.
Wow.
And Jim Liu was kind of like something that sounded like laughter in between each statement. So I just want to point out that laughter is cultural.
Yeah, laughter is cultural. It becomes interesting here that within the same culture, within Abraham and Sarah themselves, we're going to see a different response to the laughter. But you're right, it's cultural and it has to be understood in context. That's 100% correct. Okay, so let's just look back for a moment to Genesis, not chapter 18, but chapter 17, and then we'll see if we can try to compare a little bit, hopefully, maybe. So this is God coming to Abraham, telling him about the commandment to circumcise, and telling him to change Sarah's name because Sarah's going to have a son. And right, look at verse 15 and 16. 15 and 16, and God said to Abraham, your wife Sarai, you shall not call her name Sarai, for Sarah is her name. And I will bless her, and I will give you a son from her. And I will bless her, and she will become a mother of nations. Kings of nations will be from her. Okay, beautiful. And Abraham fell on his face and rejoiced. This doesn't work. They translated it differently. The verse Hebrew, and Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Vayipol Avraham al panav vayitzchak. Abraham fell on his face and laughed. And he said to himself, will a child be born to one who is 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth? And here, God doesn't intervene. The conversation continues. Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael lives before you. In other words, he says, I don't really, he was concerned that if a new child will be born, that's because there's a certain deficiency in the old child. So Abraham says, no, I want Ishmael. I don't want almost like saying, don't do me any favors. So this is a problem of why doesn't God why isn't God offended by Abraham's laughter? Now, when you read the English, you don't have any questions because
Stone translated as laughter.
I'm sorry, Stone, very good. Stone does laughter, but you read it over here it's not a question because here it says, and rejoiced, nothing wrong with joy. But Vicky is right. Vicky tells me that Stone, the English Stone translates it as is and laughed. And that's really what the verse says, Vayitzchak, and he laughed. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? So let's start with Rashi. You probably won't like Rashi, but it doesn't matter. We'll do him anyway. Says Rashi like this. So before we even get to Rashi, Rashi is now going to quote from Onkelos. Who is Onkelos? Onkelos is the Aramaic first century translation of the Torah into Aramaic. And like any translation, as you see right here, a translation is a commentary. And Onkelos was the whole story about Onkelos, which you maybe were familiar with. He was the nephew of Titus, the Roman king who destroyed the Second Temple. He converted to Judaism, wrote a translation of the Torah into Aramaic, which is printed in most editions of the Bible. Fascinating, very, very, very early translation. So it's very authoritative. Rashi quotes him often, not always does Rashi agree. Many times Rashi disagrees, but here he quotes Onkelos. And now, what is Onkelos going to say? Onkelos has a problem. Onkelos says that in other words, he doesn't articulate the problem, but there's a very big problem with the verse. The problem is, how come Abraham laughs and God is not offended, and Sarah laughs and God is offended? So what does Onkelos do? Onkelos changes the word. And as Jill pointed out, laughter may have different connotations. And Onkelos says, this translation is rejoice. When Abraham laughs, it's rejoice. And when Sarah laughs, it's disbelief. And that's how Onkelos solves the problem. The problem is that the Torah uses the same word. The Torah says Vayitzchak, and they laughed. And with Sarah, Vatitzchak, it's the same word. So so it's not so easy to it's not a perfect how does Onkelos know? Onkelos only knows that the meaning of laughter is different because God's reaction is different, but there's actually no proof from the text itself other than the result of the laughter. But let's read Rashi, who quotes Onkelos. Here we go. And Abraham, let's see if I can make this bigger. Yep. And Abraham fell on his face and rejoiced. Hebrew Vayitzchak, and he rejoiced. Onkelos renders this as an expression of joy, vachadi. That's how Onkelos translates it. He says, Abraham fell on his face, vachadi. And vachadi is Aramaic for rejoice. But the one in the case of Sarah, below chapter 18, verse 12, he renders it as an expression of laughter. There he says umakich, which is not even laughter. It's almost like disbelief. You learn that Abraham believed and rejoiced, but Sarah did not believe and ridiculed. And for this reason, the Holy One, blessed be he, was angry with Sarah, but was not angry with Abraham. So this interpretation takes a very harsh view of Sarah and basically says that even though the Torah uses the same word of laughter for both Abraham and Sarah, nevertheless, Abraham is not rebuked and Sarah is rebuked. Why so? Because it's a different laughter. How do you know? We don't know. We only know from the result. But Onkelos says that the first case is vachadi, he rejoiced, Abraham rejoiced, and Sarah laughed, and Sarah ridiculed. And that's why God was not upset with Abraham, but was upset with Sarah. That is what Rashi does to solve this problem. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I had a question about translation because in verse 12 it says it's in Stone Chumash. It says it's in Sarah laughed at herself rather than in the previous chapter. Abraham just laughed. So to Sarah's defense, I would say that it's not disbelief, the way it's translated. It's just she was doubting her ability, not something. So she laughed at herself or to herself. So what is the context here? in
Very good. So you're saying that you're saying something other than Rashi. Rashi doesn't go into the word bikirba in her midst, right? That's what the verse says. Chapter 18, the verse says that Yitzchak Sarah bikirba and Sarah laughed within herself. So you're introducing that issue, which is a good observation. But that's already different than Rashi. Rashi is just addressing the word about Yitzchak. So you're saying, let's open up the verse that you're quoting. Let's open up the verse. Let's see if we can find it here.
it's verse 12.
Yeah, I just have to see if I can figure out how Zoom will grab that page because I have both of them open, 17 and 18, so it's getting me confused. Here we go. So verse 12, and Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have become worn out, I will have smooth flesh, and also my master is old. So let me putting your thought aside, let's hold on to your thought for a second. Let me just address this issue. We have a separate problem besides the fact of how come God didn't laugh. God wasn't offended with Abraham's laughter. He was only offended with Sarah's laughter. Did Sarah lie? Did Sarah lie?
Well, based on the translation here, the one that you read, the question is that she didn't laugh out loud, and it said to herself. So that's a two different kind of translation.
Very good. So let's deal with this for a second. So did Sarah lie? Verse 12 says, and Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh because she was afraid. And he said, no, but you laughed. Did Sarah lie? Sarah said, I didn't laugh. Did she lie? So one interpretation, I think a good interpretation is Sarah didn't lie because Abraham comes to her and says, did you laugh? And the answer is she didn't laugh. Where did she laugh? She laughed in her heart. Laughing in your heart is not laughing by one definition. So Abraham says, oh, no, you did laugh, meaning I know what's going, I know that you laughed. I know that you don't believe. I know that you're sort of, you think this is absurd. Now, at that point, even actually a little before, let's go back a little bit. Kiareya, she was afraid. What was she afraid of? She was afraid of her husband. Sarah denied, saying, I did not laugh because she was afraid. Who was she afraid of? Afraid of her husband? Oh, his husband's gonna. Why is she afraid of her husband? He's a nice guy. He's an old guy. What's he gonna do? So the commentaries point out that it could be if she laughed inside, and now Abraham says, "Why did you laugh?" Now she's afraid that because she realizes he knows this from God, right? Look at verse 12. And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? So this is like, if she laughed and Abraham says, why did you laugh? That's not awe-inspiring. But if she didn't laugh, she only laughed within herself, right? That's what the verse says, verse 12. And Sarah laughed within herself. So now when Abraham says, why did you laugh? Meaning Abraham knows what's going on within her because God communicated that to Abraham. Sarah's taken aback. But in any case, I'm going from topic to topic. I want to stay focused for a second. Sarah did not laugh out loud. Sarah laughed inside her heart. So she said, I didn't laugh, meaning I didn't laugh out loud. Then Abraham says, no, you laughed, meaning you inside your heart, you think it's absurd. And Sarah's silent. Why? Because she's not disagreeing with Abraham. In other words, that's what you meant by laugh? Yeah, I did laugh. So that's a good observation, but I still don't know why, whether or not she laughed out loud or not. It still asks the question, does this, how come God is not upset or not surprised at Abraham's laughter, and yet God protests of Sarah's laughter? It says, Abraham fell on his face and laughed. Well, unless you're Onkelos says, no, he didn't laugh, he rejoiced. Okay, but it's circular logic. Give me a second, Zina. It's circular logic. Onkelos is only saying that because of the result, but how come the verse itself doesn't indicate that there's a difference between Abraham's laughter and Sarah's laughter? Go ahead, Zina. But you're on mute. You have to unmute. Zina, you have to unmute. You have to unmute.
It's kind of a small question. I believe it wasn't customary to leave the meeting or gathering of that importance, right?
Right.
17. So she actually offended everybody in the room, including angels and actually the God. And she got away with it.
So you're saying, yeah, okay. So it's interesting. That is, I have to think about it, because the traditional view would be the opposite. The traditional view is that she wasn't supposed to be with the guests because she was supposed to be modest. So she's supposed to be in the tent. In other words, forget about if that was right or wrong. That was the culture. Culture at the time is that she's in the tent, and that would be considered acceptable. And that's why when they say to him, to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? He says in the tent. They don't say, oh, let's call Sarah, because it would be considered not modest. Instead, it's where is Sarah? Sarah should listen up, but not to bring her. So that would be the tradition. That would be the traditional view. Not that in that culture that was considered the norm. You're giving another interpretation, that maybe there's a broader issue that she didn't come out to hear the word of God. I have to think about it. That's certainly interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first thing that we want to say is as follows. How do we do this? Let's take the first. So for a very long time, everybody followed Rashi and Onkelos. Remember, Rashi is almost 1,000 years after Onkelos, and this was considered and many other commentaries are pretty much saying the same idea, that Abraham believed, Sarah did not believe, and that's why God is upset at Sarah, not at Abraham. But the verse uses the same word, because the same word, like Jill said, laugh could be disbelief, laugh could be joy, two types of laughter, but the Torah chooses to use the same type of word. Okay. Then at a certain point in the game, we start getting interpretations that start defending Sarah. But I don't mean a certain point in the game in the last 100 years. I mean in the last 1,000 years. So you start with people like Nachmanides, and they introduce just an interesting concept. And it's not going to sort of absolve Sarah's. It's not going to help us entirely, but it starts defending Sarah. What happens is like this. Abraham. So let's assume that this is right. Let's assume that Abraham rejoices and Sarah doesn't believe. We're still going to go with that interpretation of Onkelos and Rashi. Still going to go with that interpretation, but we're going to defend Sarah and say, why is it okay that Sarah doesn't believe? So the first interpretation ties into what Jill said. Let's think about this for a second. God appeared to Abraham and said, Sarah is going to have a son. God spoke to Abraham. Abraham laughed. Abraham believes in God. So Abraham laughed. That you must interpret that laugh as disbelief, as joy. Sarah, God never spoke to Sarah. In fact, who told Sarah she's going to have a son? An Arabian person, just a simple person. She had no idea it's an angel. She had no reason to believe this is prophecy. So of course Sarah laughs in disbelief. That it explains why Sarah will laugh and Abraham won't. Why Sarah will laugh mockingly and Abraham won't, because Abraham has a direct communication from God, and Sarah does not. Sarah just says, some stranger up the street says, "Oh, you're going to have a son." She starts laughing. That's ridiculous. Now God says, 1 second. It's not that she laughed at a promise from God. God is saying, why do you think this is absurd? God to do anything, so it can happen. So why are you laughing? So what we just did is we still accepted the model that Abraham laughed because of joy and Sarah laughed in disbelief. But we're defending Sarah and we're saying, why does Sarah laugh in disbelief? Because Sarah did not, like I said, Sarah heard it from a guy off the street. There's no reason for Sarah to believe that there's any form of prophecy in this person talking. Later, when Abraham says, why did you laugh? And she says, I didn't, meaning I didn't laugh out loud. And then he says, no, you laughed. Now Sarah's like, oops, if Abraham knows this, this is prophecy. It must be that what that guy said is true. And in other words, the guy said it as a form of prophecy. So that still keeps the model of Abraham is joy, Sarah is mocking, but what it does is it's saying that's defending Sarah. Why does Sarah laugh? Because Sarah heard it from a stranger. Now, and not from God. Now, Nachmanides goes even further to defend Sarah. And to defend Sarah, he says something actually very, very radical. Not everybody agrees with him. What Nachmanides says is that Abraham never told Sarah about the promise that he heard 3 days earlier. Right? We assume that according to the rabbinic tradition, it could be the same day. If you read the pshat, the simple meaning, it sounds like it's the same day. But if you want to follow the rabbinic tradition, it's 3 days earlier. 3 days earlier, God tells Abraham that circumcise and Sarah will have a son. Genesis chapter 17. 3 days later, Genesis chapter 18. Nachmanides says Abraham never told Sarah of God's command. So now, when the stranger comes, of God's promise, not the command, he told her about the command to change her name, and he told her about the circumcision. Obviously, he circumcised himself, but he didn't say that, he didn't tell her the promise that you're going to have a son. That's what Nachmanides learns. Why is he doing that? He wants to defend our grandmother, Sarah, right? So you want to basically say that Sarah never heard about the commandment from God, heard it from a stranger, so she laughs. She says it's absurd. God says it's absurd. Nothing's absurd. God could do anything. You always have to have faith. Don't think something's absurd. God can always help you. So it's basically keeping the model that Abraham was happy, Sarah laughed. But what it's doing is defending Sarah by saying, Sarah, we understand why she laughed. You never heard it from God. Now, Nachmanides has other problems, and this raises other problems. Why wouldn't Abraham tell that to Sarah? And he has two answers. Number one, he was too busy. He had to circumcise himself, and his whole family is too busy. That's hard to accept. He's too busy. He forgot to tell her he's going to have a son. But so his other answer is, Abraham says, why should I tell her? Let God tell her. In other words, God wants to tell, let God tell her. Just like I got the revelation, let God tell it to her. That's Nachmanides' interpretation. My interpretation is that Abraham didn't want to tell her. It'd be too hard for her, because it must have been so painful for Sarah that she did not have a child, to start telling her that you're going to have a child. Who knows how she's going to react? Who knows if she's going to be happy or sad? He's afraid. This is a big piece of news, and it's an emotionally complicated piece of news. So he's afraid to do it. That's my interpretation. But whatever the case is, you see what Nachmanides is doing. In order to defend Sarah, Nachmanides is saying that, first of all, Sarah had no idea that these angels are, that these guests are angels. They have no idea that they're speaking prophecy. So when they say, when a guy comes in off the street and says, you can have a child, she laughs. It's absurd. Because it wasn't a prophet. She didn't know it was a prophecy. She wasn't laughing at God. She was laughing at the guy, right? When we were kids, we said, someone's laughing, and then they say, they're not laughing with you, they're laughing at you, right? So here, Sarah's not laughing at God, she's laughing at the stranger. What are you talking about? You're ridiculous. Then she realizes, oh, no, this guy's carrying the word of God. So that is what Nachmanides does to defend Sarah. And he goes so far, and Nachmanides wants to defend her so badly that he says, you know what? She never even knew about the promise from God to Abraham. Why not? Abraham didn't tell her. Why not? Either he was too busy, or he said, let God do it. I think that Nachmanides' interpretation of let God do it basically says, I can't do it. It's too hard for me. Maybe I could see that this would be a complicated conversation, painful conversation. So maybe she'll believe, maybe she won't, maybe it will trigger her. I don't know. So he says, I'm not dealing with this. Let God come and do it. So God comes and God sends the angel. Now she laughs because she never heard about it from God. So that's how Nachmanides is sort of veering away from Rashi, veering away from Onkelos, a 1,000-year tradition of saying Abraham good, Sarah, when Sarah laughed, it was disbelief. And we start the trend of starting to defend Sarah, saying, of course Sarah's going to laugh. She heard it from a stranger. Okay, point one. I hope we're defending our grandmother here. That's what we're trying to do. Then we come, a few hundred years later, we come to Abarbanel. And Abarbanel says something the exact opposite. And he's the first one who disagrees with the model of Onkelos, disagrees with the model of Rashi, disagrees with the model of Nachmanides. No, it's the same laughter, same disbelief. Same laughter, same disbelief. He says it's the same word. In Aramaic, there's two words, vachadi, and he rejoiced, umakich, and ridiculed. So Hebrew, you can also find two words. So Abarbanel says, no. They both did the same thing. They both laughed in disbelief. So how come God is upset at Abraham and not upset at Sarah? There's favorites here. So Abarbanel sometimes says something very, very creative. He says, no, you're allowed to laugh in disbelief the first time you hear it. It's a shock. But Sarah He disagrees with Nachmanides, with Nachmanides. God told Abraham. Abraham told Sarah. 3 days later, the guests come and reiterate it. She laughs the second time 3 days later. So God says, you can laugh 3 days later. You had 3 days, you already heard it. The second time you can't laugh. There's no excuse to laugh the second time. The first time you hear it, of course you're going to laugh. It's absurd. Even if you believe in God, God comes and says, you're going to have a child at 90. It's absurd. You laugh. And that's acceptable. That's fine. Abraham laughs, Sarah, there's no problem. The problem is that once you already have the promise, 3 days passed, you hear it again, and now you laugh again, that's not acceptable, according to Abarbanel. The reason why I like Abarbanel is because what he says he's going, the pshat is going to simple. He's saying, no, Abraham and Sarah had the same reaction. The only problem is that Sarah had the same reaction 3 days later. Now, so how are we going to defend Sarah? So one way to defend Sarah is to steal from Nachmanides and say yes, even though it was 3 days later, but she heard it from the stranger. She heard it from a stranger, from a guy off the street, so she laughed. So we can combine both. We could defend Sarah. We can defend Sarah. We don't have to say that Abraham didn't laugh. Abraham laughed as well, and that's sort of the two approaches we have, two general approaches to defend Sarah. Now I'm going to give you the modern approach. The modern approaches are actually going to defend Sarah completely. I think we'll try to deal with the modern approach. But so far, these are really the two approaches. Again, just to summarize quickly, I don't want to spend the whole class on the laughter here, but summarize quickly. Approach one: Abraham rejoiced. Sarah did not believe. That's Onkelos and Rashi. Why is of course Sarah comes out looking pretty bad because she doesn't believe. Comes Nachmanides and says, why did Sarah not believe? Because she heard it off a guy in the street. Not so bad. We're sort of saying that Sarah's disbelief is not so terrible. Then the other approach is no, they both didn't believe, but it's okay because the reason. So why wasn't Abraham upset at Abraham? Why wasn't God upset at Abraham? Because it's the first time. Because it's the first time. Okay, now.
Rabbi, I have a question. Isn't it also that Sarah is questioning something about her own ability to
Yes.
bear a child,
Yes.
whereas Abraham already has a son, right?
Yeah.
He already has Ishmael. So when he's laughing about something that it's not questioning anything about himself. Whereas Sarah is questioning that this, this miracle could happen to her, that she could.
Your interpretation is a great interpretation. Only women say it, men never say it, which supports your argument. Let me explain what I mean. In other words, if you're Abraham and you say your wife is going to have you have a child, so Abraham, okay, you believe it, why not? Right? He doesn't know. You're oblivious anyway. You don't know what's going on within the woman's body. For a woman who knows what's going on within herself, knows that it's that she can't have children anymore. So for her to believe is much more difficult because it's much more absurd because it's not theoretical. She sees within herself. She sees that the time has passed and having a child is absurd. And she has to be an internal transformation within herself naturally to be able to have a child. So for Abraham, it's very easy to believe because he's oblivious. But for Sarah to believe is absurd. And that's why Sarah's going to laugh. And that's why it's not that Abraham is a bigger believer than Sarah. It's that for Sarah, to believe, for Sarah to accept it is it would be a much greater act of faith. But it's almost like it's impossible because it smacks in the face of what she sees within herself. And that what you're doing is you're defending Sarah. And the fact that no man could say what you said is the reason why Abraham didn't realize this. In other words, Abraham, God says your wife will have a child. Okay, fine, wife will have a child. Right? He doesn't know. He doesn't feel. It's not in his face. It's not obvious to him that it's absurd. But for the woman knows within herself. That's Vatizchak Sarah. That's Vicky's word. Sarah laughed within her midst. Bikir ba. What is it within her midst? From seeing within herself. This is absurd. From within myself. This is absurd. Right? So it's sort of obvious to her that this is absurd, and that's why she laughs. And God says, one second, God doesn't come to be upset. God says, God's coming to educate her and say, even though, what is faith? Faith is that even though all the statistics and everything you see tells you one thing, you have to understand that statistics and the charts don't always tell the whole story. So when God intervenes, he's not upset at her, so to speak. He's sort of trying to educate Sarah and saying, why do you think it's absurd, despite the fact that all the evidence says it's absurd? Because anything withheld from God? Can't God do anything? So that's almost like God coming down, sort of continuing to educate Sarah. He's not coming to scream at her. He's coming to educate her. Not educate her. I know, educate is the wrong word. He's trying to expand her faith and say that, yes, even when reality is telling you one thing, we still believe that God is not trapped and God could change it. But again, question, why did Abraham laugh and Sarah, why did Abraham believe and Sarah didn't? Assuming we're taking Rashi and Onkelos' interpretation, that Abraham was happy and Sarah didn't believe. So Beth's answer is, of course, Sarah is not going to believe. How could Sarah believe? Because she sees within herself, it's an impossibility. Abraham doesn't know what's going on. He's a man. He doesn't know what's going on. So in that sense, again, what you're doing is you're defending Sarah, but you're also defending God, because now what you're saying, Beth, is that God wasn't really upset at Sarah. He's just teaching Sarah that, yes, that's the meaning of faith. The meaning of faith is that even when it seems like it's impossible, God says, is anything impossible? No, nothing is impossible. So thank you, Beth. That helps. Now, I'm going to say one more thing, even though maybe we're spending too much time on this, but I'm going to say one more thing, and that is like this. Laughter and joy and happiness only comes from the unexpected, only comes from the absurd, right? If you tell somebody that they're healthy and they're young, that you're going to have a child, they're happy, but they don't laugh. Laugh, the term, in other words, let's go back a second. Let's assume Rashi and let's assume Rashi and Onkelos are right. Let's assume that Abraham was happy and Sarah ridiculed, and Sarah didn't believe. So my question was, so why does the Torah use the same word? Why does the Torah use the same word of laughter? If it's two different meanings, joy and ridicule, why does the Torah use the same verb, vatitzchak, and vayitzchak, he laughed? Why use the same word to create the confusion? And you need Rashi to tell you, oh, no, one is laughter, one is ridicule. Just use the same word. We use two different words. So what I think is, the Torah uses the same word because to tell you that they're intertwined is very hard to separate. The more absurd the concept is, the more laughter it brings, right? So when Abraham believes, the point is Abraham believes, even if he's laughing and he's rejoicing because it's absurd. And Sarah, when she thinks it's absurd, it's because it's absurd, okay? Now, very interesting. What does God tell Abraham to name? God tells Abraham to name. Who does God tell Abraham? One second, let me check this up. The bottom line is, without looking into who told who to do what, the name that they name their child is Yitzchak, should laugh. But by this definition, Yitzchak means should laugh because of the absurdity. So imagine you name your kid, your name is laughter. Your name is a joke. You're a joke. You're one big joke. This kid is going to need tremendous therapy, right? So why do they name their child Vayitzchak and you will laugh? So the point here is they give birth to a child, and they name him laughter. They're basically saying your creation is absurd. Now, what are they saying? That it's absurd, you shouldn't be here? No, because it's so absurd, that's why we're so happy you're here. And the reality is, it's a surprise that you're here. It's a reality is, we'll get to that later, the whole existence of the Jewish people is a miracle and is absurd. We shouldn't be here based on all the statistics. Based on nature, we shouldn't be here. But not just now, after all the persecution for 3,500 years, but from our inception, we the Jewish people are absurd. Isaac is absurd from the inception. So what's happening here is we're telling Isaac, Or when we name Isaac, we tell Isaac, don't forget that you're absurd. In other words, don't forget that your existence is absurd. And therefore, remember, it's intertwined. The more absurd, the more excitement, the more happy, the more surprising. And therefore, never lose the joy, never lose the awe, the excitement, the disbelief in the positive sense. Never take yourself for granted. Never take your life for granted. Understand your life is a miracle. Preserve the absurdity within the process of your creation. So that's why whether Avram was joyous or whether Sarah thought it was absurd, they're both the same word because one affects the other. The more absurd, the more joy. The more joy, the more absurd. And what's happening here is God says to Sarah, why did you laugh? Meaning to say, ask yourself, are you laughing because you don't believe? Or are you laughing because you're happy because the absurdity is actually going to bring you more joy? Which one is it? And she says, no, I didn't laugh. And God says, no, you did laugh. Nothing wrong with laugh. Don't deny the laughter. The laughter is good. The fact that it was absurd is actually good because we want to preserve that. And in fact, they preserve that in the name. So in that sense, it's much more subtle because you can't say, is absurdity, is mocking, is it good or bad? It's not good or bad. It's complex. The more absurd, if you think it's absurd, the more joy you can produce. So when God tells her, why did you laugh? It's like asking you, so figure this out, work this through. Yes, you think it's absurd, but work this through. Why is it absurd? Because it's unnatural. Also, when it's going to happen, it's going to lead to more joy. And that's exactly what happened. If you want to describe her birth, it says, Sarah rejoiced. She said, everybody who will hear of this will rejoice, and named him Yitzchak. But remember, Yitzchak could also mean absurd. Rejoice as in this is crazy, because they both tie in. So in that sense, when you read this word, Lama zeh tzachaka Sarah, why did Sarah laugh? It could be rebuke, or the way I think, at least I'm putting forth this interpretation right here. It wasn't fully crystallized in my brain until I said it now. So now I think it's fresh from right now. Just came into my head. But I think that I'll put it up for a vote. If you like it, good. If not, reject it, no problem. But I think that when God tells her, let's read the verse. This is fun. This is exciting. When this is a surprise, that's joy. I wasn't thinking of this on the way in here. But in any case, when God says, Vayomer Hashem Avraham, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? Saying, is it really true that I will give birth although I am old? Why did she laugh? Why could mean why? Why did you do this? As in, you shouldn't have done this. Or why means, ask yourself this question. What is the nature of your laughter? Understand that the absurdity is true, but the absurdity is not necessarily bad. The absurdity doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Absurdity means that when it happens, you rejoice because it's so absurd. Now she got defensive. And Abraham says, no, but you laughed. Lo, kitzachak, you laughed, meaning the fact that you laughed is good. Remember, if the laughter would be such a, if Sarah was rebuked by God for laughing, why would she name her son Laughter? To perpetuate sort of that quote unquote sin that she laughed. Maybe it's not a sin. Maybe there's nothing wrong. Maybe it's good. Maybe God was trying to say, instead of rejecting the laughter, analyze it. Okay, Adkan. Up till here's what I have to say on this. Took much more time than I thought it would take, but I'm happy because at least I crystallized this point. But if anyone has any comments or questions on this, please share. Otherwise, we move forward.
I like that interpretation a lot because it also uncovers the nature of Jewish humor.
Right. Jewish humor is funny. Why are we funny? Because our existence is absurd. So no kidding, we can come up with that. No kidding, we can come up with that. All we have to do is describe our absurd reality and people are already laughing. Yes. Right. Go ahead, Jill. But you have to unmute. Jill, you have to unmute if you want us to hear you.
Yes, they both laughed, and therefore their son was called Laughter.
Yes.
So it was the fact that both of them named him.
Yes, they both named him. They both laughter. But so now begs the question. So how was Sarah's laughter bad? So if you want to combine everything we said in the last 40 minutes, especially what Beth said, I would say Sarah, they both, every time you laugh, there's some joy and some absurdity. You have to have both. Of the mix of those two ingredients, with Sarah, there was more absurdity. Because like Beth says, a woman knows from herself that this is impossible. She laughed within herself, this is impossible. So with Sarah, there's more absurdity. What does that mean, more absurdity? More absurdity just means there'll be more joy when it happens. And that's what God is telling Sarah to define. Figure this out. Understand, absurd. Why did you laugh? You laugh because it's absurd? Or are you going to rethink about that and realize that the absurdity doesn't mean it cannot happen. The absurdity means that when it happens, I rejoice even more.
Robert, didn't they both say the same thing to themselves? I'm too old for this. They both said the same, exactly the same thing.
That's right. That's right. And that's the question. And that's why Onkelos has to go out of his way. And that's why Rashi has to go out of his way. And that's why the English translation here says Abraham was rejoiced. Yes, if I am old, meaning it's unexpected. If it's unexpected, it leads to laughter. Because like I said, the more absurd the thing is, the more laughter you'll get. If you're expecting something, it doesn't cause you to laugh. A joke has to have a twist that's unexpected. So you're right. The facts are the same. Both for Sarah and for Abraham, the facts are the same. They're too old, and therefore it's absurd. The question is, does absurdity lead to joy, or does absurdity lead to mockery? And I do think that I do agree with Beth that even though Abraham says I'm old and Sarah says I'm old, it means two different things for the male and the female. Because the woman who has to go through the process of carrying the baby knows that how absurd it is. The man knows in the theoretical. The woman knows it from herself, and therefore, for Sarah, it is more absurd, and that's why she's not going to just accept it the way Abraham does. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's because it's so absurd. Now, especially as you heard it from the guy on the street. Now, I happen to think, okay, fine. Let's stop here. I see we're not going to make much progress into the next stories here. So we have 4 minutes left. So let me tell you what I think. And it could be it's completely wrong. It could be you're going to disagree. It could be you're going to think it's offensive. Doesn't matter. I'm just giving you all the trigger warnings right now. And we'll tell you what I think. And I may be wrong. Okay, so let's think about this. Jill pointed out that God speaks to Abraham. God does not speak to Sarah. God does not speak to Sarah, at least not about this. And Abraham hears that he's going to have a child from God. And Sarah hears that she's going to have a child from a person who she thinks is just a guy on the street, just a regular person. What is that telling us? What is that telling us? So we discussed this in the past, and and Kabbalistically, you have the masculine model and the feminine model. And masculine is the model that wants to be dominant. In other words, when the masculine wants to affect something, the masculine wants to superimpose its perspective. And that's the way the masculine wants to make progress. The feminine, again, is not necessarily males and females, because we discussed many times that both males and females have both masculine attributes and feminine attributes, because we have 10 sefirot, some are masculine, some are feminine, without going into all of this. But from the perspective of the Torah, the man or the masculine wants to dominate, it wants to superimpose its view. The feminine, on the other hand, is not seeking to superimpose its view, not seeking to superimpose its view. The feminine wants to cultivate, and the feminine wants to teach the other person to reach that conclusion. In other words, if the female, the feminine attribute, wants, for example, the child to do something, it doesn't say you better do it or I'm going to punish you. Sometimes mothers do that. My mother did that, but that's okay. That's the masculine aspect. But that's one way to do it, superimpose your view. The other way is to cultivate within the other person the desire to do so. And then it's coming from them. So you're doing it, but you're doing it not in the masculine way, you're doing it in the feminine way. In other words, spiritually speaking, masculine energy would be to superimpose the divine will in the world. Feminine energy would mean to show that the world itself could reflect the will of God without breaking it. Okay, so that's really the difference. The masculine energy would say, we have to change the world, we have to break the world, we have to superimpose the goodness within the world. Feminine energy would say, no, give the world a chance, let it work itself out, and let it discover that what it really wants is goodness. That's the difference in masculine and feminine energy from the Kabbalistic perspective. Let's tie this into here. May or may not be right, but if you want to come from that perspective, assuming we accept that model, we can discuss that after 10:30. But assuming we accept that model, God speaks to Abraham. That represents something out of this world. The transcendent God telling God, "Don't worry, I'm going to come in here. I'm going to make some change." Sarah hears the word of God, not from God. She hears the word of God from the world itself. There are people telling her that the impossible is possible. But it's not coming from the voice of God, it's coming from the voice of humans. So in the feminine model, the world itself appreciates that the laws of nature are not set in stone, that things can happen, that surprises could take place, that statistics statistics could be defied. But who's telling it to her? It's not the word of God. It's the word of the people. Because the feminine could see within the world that's the feminine can bring out from within the world itself. The world itself is open to the divine perspective. So why is it that God doesn't speak to the woman? Why? Because the man is better than the woman? No, because the woman doesn't need to hear it from God. She could hear it from nature. And that may or may not be true, but that's what I was thinking about. So it's certainly true that I was thinking about it. Could be it's wrong. So that's for you to decide. Steve,
Also,
Steve has a question. Let me just thank everybody for coming. And we'll continue next week, God willing, in good health. So we don't take any prisoners. 10:30, the class is over. We have to end on time. Those who want to stay and talk about this for the rest of the day, the rest of the week, you're welcome to. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining. Steve,
Thank
please
you,
share.
Rabbi. Happy
Thank
New
you.
Year.
Thank you. You too.
Happy New Year.
Thank you. Steve, go ahead. But we have to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. You did not say that, you did not say this directly, but perhaps it's an inference from, or a logical conclusion from, going down the path of what you said. But is truth a function of the source that we hear it from?
No, but truth, at least from the philosophically, truth is, that's a good question. So I don't know if I'm going to address exactly what you're saying, but truth is true when it's true. Truth is true when it could be applied everywhere, right? So, right, if the experiment could be reproduced anytime, anywhere, then it's true. But if it only works some of the time, it's not the truth. So when God says the truth is so and so, that's what God says. Is that the truth? In some sense, it's the truth. But if humanity rejects it, then it's not really the truth, because by this definition, truth means there's a I don't know who exactly who says it, but one of the Jewish philosophers says that emet, truth, has to agree to itself from all directions. In other words, if it only works in some of the cases, it's not true. So if God says the truth is so and creation says that's nonsense. So is it true? In one sense, it's true, but it's not ultimately true until everybody recognizes it. Then it's true from all dimensions. So all I'm trying to say is there's two ways to get to the truth. It doesn't really matter where it comes from, but the question is, how do we get there is significant, because truth has to be self-evident. For truth to be ultimately true, it has to be self-evident, and it has to come from everywhere. So there's two ways to do this. There's God descending on Mount Sinai telling us the truth, and then there's humanity working through and realizing this truth. And only when we contribute our perspective to the truth is the truth fully truth. Again, what is truth? We can sit here for a year, right? And read 1,000 books about what is truth. But by this definition of truth has to come, ultimate truth has to be evident from every angle. So then where it comes from is significant. Not that it's not true if it doesn't come from the humanity, but if it's only superimposed upon us, but we don't really feel it. You tell your child, okay, let me give you an example, and then I'll take Bob's question, then Beth. You tell your child, broccoli is good for you. Is that a true statement? The answer is, by some definition, yes, it's true, broccoli is good. However, if you don't like broccoli, your taste buds repel it. Is it true that broccoli is good? It's good on some level. But is it true on all levels? No, because there's a perspective where broccoli is not good. But if I start eating broccoli and now I actually enjoy the taste of broccoli, now broccoli is true. But not because my mother told me it's true, because my taste buds told me it's true. Now it's really true. Because not only does my mother tell me it's true, or the science book, or the lab, but actually my taste buds tell me it's true. Now it's fully true. So that's the best I can do in this setting. But we'll have to. The question is, what is truth and what is good, and this is we have many more long years to live to figure all this out. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Rabbi, and Happy New Year. I just to kind of paraphrase and extend to what you were saying, to me, this seems like a nexus of a lot of things. Firstly, we know that Adam was born with no foreskin, and after the fall, it grew. So he was born not needing a circumcision. He was kind of born in that perfected way. When man kind of was relegated to earth, I think this is a moment where you have Brit Milah, you have the circumcision, but you also have a very earthly reality. But what God tells us in Chazal, I mean, Yitzchak and all that stuff, it's keep your one eye out for the supernatural, for the heavenward. Don't feel like you're committed to earth and the limitations of earth, that there's always the possibility, that find joy, like Viktor Frankl in the Holocaust said, look, there's always something that you can look up to. So I think this is at a time where we're seeing Lech Lecha, circumcision, angels, God, all the rest, and the supernatural. It's Jews, you are bound to lift people up on earth, but keep your eye on heaven, because we have an intimate relationship and anything is possible.
Excellent. If you permit me, I'm just going to ride the wave. And I'm going to say, if you said this in the beginning of the class, you would save me 50 minutes. But let me just tell you, Abraham has one eye in heaven, two eyes in heaven. God said, no problem, I believe. That's easy. And Bob says, you're right. We always have to keep an eye in heaven. What Sarah's doing is much, much more complicated. And where's Sarah? Sarah has one eye on heaven and one eye on her midst. In other words, one eye on earth. And that's the challenge. Could you keep an eye in heaven while being cognizant of reality on earth? And that's why for Abraham, it's easy, because I would argue Abraham has two eyes in heaven. Sarah has one eye in heaven, one eye on earth. That's the balance. And that's why she needs help sort of balancing these two, because the input from heaven and the input from her midst are telling you two different things. But that's the tightrope that every Jew has to walk. And sometimes it's hard. And sometimes God has to come and help you believe. So I like what you said. And I would say the true challenge is Sarah's challenge, and we are Sarah. Abraham believes in heaven. He has no problem.
And that's why we actually memorialize the laughter by calling him Isaac.
Yes. It's only absurd if you have one eye in the earth.
Correct.
It's not that absurd. It's happy. It's not absurd because he's not really focusing on earth. But if you're the physician, you see the charts, you see the statistics, and then you see the statistics being defied. That's the laughter. So thank you. Go ahead, Beth.
This is more a question born out of my ignorance, or lack of memory. So in the Torah, we often hear about like a couple being barren or a woman being barren. I can't recall, are there instances where it specifically says that a man is unable to, like where it doesn't involve a woman, what, not that the couple is barren or that the woman is barren, but that where it says that the man is unable to conceive a child.
It does say it in the not in the narrative part, but if you want to look at Deuteronomy, for example, where God blesses the Jewish people, they won't have barren, that they won't be barren. It says there won't be akar va'akara. There won't be barren in the masculine and in the feminine. So there was certainly the notion that we understood that it doesn't have to be the woman's quote unquote fault, but the deficiency, the physical deficiency, could be within the male. That's clear. That's clear in Deuteronomy, like I said. In the narrative, you don't really see it unless you think about this as, I'm just trying to think if you see this in the narrative of Genesis. I don't remember. I think the Medrash makes the point that Abraham was barren because the stargazers which at the time were considered the scientists, told Abraham that you cannot have any children. And therefore, when God comes to Abraham at the covenant between the parts and says, you're going to have a child, even Yishmael, even before Yitzchak, he was still younger, he had to say, he took him outside. And Rashi quotes the Medrash and says, outside, he says, go out of your limitations, the limitations of astrology. In other words, at least from the rabbinic tradition, they say that it wasn't just Sarah who was not being able to give birth, but Abraham cannot. And Abraham has to defy nature to be able to give birth even to Ishmael, even before Sarah. And Kabbalistically, they discuss this as well, because they say Abraham is a level of chachma, of wisdom, but wisdom, abstract wisdom. And birth spiritually comes from the ability, the feminine ability to express the abstract wisdom in tangible terms. And Abraham, that really was not his forte. That wasn't necessarily his skill spiritually. So to summarize, in rabbinic literature, there certainly is Abraham is as described as someone who's barren. In the narrative of the Torah itself, I don't think you'll see it. You'll only see it in Genesis, at least, that it's primarily the women who are barren. But like I said, in Deuteronomy, in the Torah itself, also in the 5th book, the Torah is certainly cognizant that there is Akar, which is a male who is barren, and Akara, a female. So I hope.
Yeah, I mean, this is not a biology class, and I don't want to get graphic, but obviously.
It's a question of how did they see reality at the time? What medical knowledge did they have at the time?
But I'm saying, because a man, is not going to realize, like I said, I'm not going to get graphic here, but a man, for a woman, she, like it says in the Torah, like she knows that her womanly, like the manifestation of her fertility is gone. Whereas for a man, they never know whether they're fertile or not. It's the same, biologically, you know what I'm talking about. I don't want to get.
Yes, but you see that they knew it, and I don't think they needed the faith. I think you could see that the scientific methods to figure this out, where you have a woman who was with one man and did not conceive, and then with another man and did conceive, and the man is not able to conceive, even though there was polygamy, and we could have multiple female partners. So I think they knew this. They certainly knew this, as you could see from the Torah, from Deuteronomy. Yes, they certainly knew that.
So Deuteronomy, okay, because I couldn't remember any instances.
If I had to prove, I would bring the verse in Deuteronomy. If I had to prove it to you, yes.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, I see if I still remembered. That kind of ties to what you said at the end about the male and female model of communication, and also the first model, the male model. Hashem exercises before the circumcision, and female, he tries on Sarah after the circumcision. That kind of ties to what Bob said also.
Yeah.
But I want to say,
in other words, I was just going to say that, if you want to speak in Bob's language, you would say that Abraham is willing to suspend what he sees and believe in God, and Sarah wants to believe in God but not suspend what she sees. And that's much harder, but that's the desired result. That's the desired result. When not your prophet told you can have a child, but the stranger, the regular man on the street told you can have a child. Meaning the world itself tells you, take it easy. Not everything that you read on the charts, people, God forbid, get diagnosed with the problem. They run to Google and Google tells them something. Not everything that Google says is when Google itself will tell you that not everything that Google says is true, then you know that Mashiach is coming.
Right.
Yeah,
that's why I wanted kind of to tie it in, because we live in the model of Sarah's communication, although it's not a completely 100% female model, but still we need to uncover.
Mashiach comes only when the feminine model is introduced. According to Kabbalah, Mashiach comes, the feminine model becomes dominant, because the whole idea is the transformation of the earth, but in other words, you may begin with a superimposition, right? Ultimately, when the child is young, sometimes you have to say, don't run into the street, and if you do, I'm going to give you a consequence, right? But that's the beginning. You don't want the child not to run into the street because mother is going to punish them. You want the child themselves to recognize that you don't run into the street. And that's the same true with all of morality. That's the same deal with all of morality. Ultimately, in the beginning, it has to be superimposed. Certainly you have to understand that the truth of this, it's not true because we like it. It's true because, like Steve Strake says, it's true because it's true. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It's true because it comes from God. But then the question is, could we internalize the truth? Could the truth be could we realize that the truth is intuitive to us? That ultimately, yes, this resonates with us. And that's the feminine model, and that's the Mashiach. That's the coming of Mashiach. And that's why before Mashiach comes, like it ever said, that's why in the world itself, the feminism begins, because that's an expression of this true truth that ultimately we cannot bring the world to full perfection before we have the celebration of the feminine model.
Right. And it did all start with circumcision, because then we kind of turned to a different model of communion.
Yes, refining of the flesh, correct, refining of the flesh, that the flesh itself could be refined. Yes, yes, yes.
Thank
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's still Sunday. You have to make sure to relax and enjoy your Sunday so you can have koyach to serve Hashem for the rest of the week. So have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. Beth, you want to have another question, or is it?
No,
Thank
no,
you,
no,
Rabbi.
thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Rabbi, you're gonna get one less email from me.
Okay.
I'm sorry about the
No problem.
headstone.
Perfect, perfect.
I'm
Thank
so
you.
sorry.
No
All
worries.
right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Be well.
Mhm.